In this video, I turn this wall into this. So the first step in the process is to mark out on the wall how you want your layout to be. You could skip this step if you want, but it's nice to see what it's actually going to look like on the wall. And it's all personal preference as far as how many panels you want versus how many rails and styles. So what I went with was about 39 inches off of the ground was the top rail. That would be the top of the top rail. And I think I went with 18 3/4 was the width of every panel. So I'm going to be building this as one unit. So the bottom baseboard that you see there, that is not attached currently. The rails are going to be attached to that, and then I'm going to put the whole thing on the wall as one solid piece. Now when you're putting any sort of wainscoting or board and batten, you really want the surface of the panels to be really smooth. So some people will lay tempered hardboard. I didn't end up going that route because it would have raised the surface of the trim further than my door trim, which I didn't want. So in my previous video, I went ahead and put wall liner over my whole wall. So the upper portion is going to be wallpaper and the bottom portion would be smooth for the wainscoting that I'm doing. So if you want to know how to do that, go look back at my previous video and you can see exactly how I did that. So I'm just setting up the stop block here to cut I think it was 5 styles that I ended up doing. And I just cut them all the exact same length. The material that I'm using for this is all primed pine finger jointed 1x4s, and the base is a 1x6, but everything else is just a regular old 1x4. So the only things I had to cut were the 5 styles and then the top rail, and then I cut this little spacer block as well so I could space out all the panels equally. I then went ahead and put the style that goes in the corner against the wall so I could scribe it to the wall because this wall isn't perfectly straight. I just used a mechanical pencil and laid it flat and just drew a line. I then went ahead and took it to the table saw to cut out that marking that I made. I did it freehand, and I also put a little bevel on the blade. That way this piece will sit really snug against the wall and the corner drywall mud won't screw it up at all. So just test fit that, make sure it's all level and lined up how you want it, and then you can move on to pocket holing all of these styles. So I didn't get footage of the first 2. I think I either forgot to film it or my camera cut out, but it's pretty simple. You just place the spacer block against the end board or the last style that you put on, put a little bit of glue, and I know that this is primed material, so the glue may not adhere very well, but it's a good reassurance just to put that on there anyway. And then I went ahead and clamped it using this Kreg face clamp. Then you can just drive the screw right through into the bottom baseboard. Now, the first ones that I put on, I actually used screws that were a little too long, and they actually poked through the other side. So make sure you're using a screw that is the right length. I think an inch-long screw would probably be your best bet. I think I was using 1 1/4 inches, and that ended up being too long. So an inch screw would probably be good, but just to be sure, you might want to do a test piece just to make sure you're not going to poke through the face of the baseboard. So this board right here, you can see I drilled a hole in the wrong spot, but nothing to worry about. Just had to shift it over and screw it in like all the other ones. So once that was done, I went and set it on the wall to see how it looks. And you can see in this shot here that all the way on the left, there's no style there. I was going to use the door frame or door trim as the final style so that it didn't look awkward putting another style right up next to the door trim. So I made it without a style all the way on the left. Your layout will determine how you want it to look, but this is what looked best for my room, so that's what I ended up going with. Then for the top rail, it's all the same. You just glue the tops of all of the pieces, and I used some other clamps to help me hold it in place. Then I used the spacer block just to make sure everything was square and lined up, and then I went ahead and drove the screws through again. So once that was all done, I set it against the wall and make sure it all fit nice and snug. And it was a perfect fit, which I was pretty pleased with. I've never done anything like this before, so it was all a learning experience for me along the way. I went ahead and marked all the studs using this stud finder so I could tack the baseboard and the top rail directly into the studs. And I used 16 gauge, I think it was 2-inch screws to attach all of this. So I was running a little bit behind yesterday, but off camera, I ended up cutting the top rail. I just cut a 2-inch strip of the same 1x material. So it's 2 inches thick. I came and I set it in place, and I also notched around here as well. So this overhangs about 1.25 inches. So I set it in place, and then this wall has a lot of drywall buildup on the edges. So I set it and scribed it to the wall. So it actually has a very long curve to it, where it's thicker in the middle and thinner on the edges. And then I just attached it with 18 gauge brad nails. So the next step in the process is to fill all the nail holes and caulk all the seams. To fill the nail holes, I'm going to be using this drydex spackling, and then I'm just using Alex Flex for the caulking. So what I'm going to be doing is all of the seams where the stiles meet the rails, I'm going to be filling with the drydex. The only place I won't do that is at the edge here. I think I'm going to leave that gap so that the door trim and the wainscoting unit look like two separate units. Every other seam will get filled though. That's part of the wainscoting. And then I'll go ahead and I'll caulk everywhere the trim meets the wall or the trim meets the trim. And then that's about it. So to fill the nail holes with this drydex, you just push it into the hole, and you want to make sure you're forcing enough in there so that it actually fills the hole pretty good. And then just rub it over with your thumb or, I don't know, the meaty part of your palm or something. But you just want to rub it so it's smooth and flat and get rid of all of the excess residue. The more you leave on, the more you'll have to sand, but you can get away with not sanding at all if you fill the holes properly. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to really leave too much proud of the surface. You can get this stuff relatively flush. Now, I also am filling these gaps, and so for the first one, I went and just shoved it in there with my fingers, but that didn't work as well as I thought it would. I ended up using another little spatula thing. It was actually a 5-in-1 tool, and I would put some of the material onto that, and then I would scrape it off with the blade so that I could load it up onto my little spatula and then just push it into the actual groove there. And that worked out a lot better than using my finger. This portion I will be sanding, so it's okay if it's proud of the surface a lot and if it isn't as smooth as you'd like it to be, because you are going to be sanding it, so keep that in mind as well. Now for caulking, you want to make sure you cut a nice, clean, smallish hole. You don't want this to be a large hole that you're letting way too much caulking out of, because when you come back and wipe it, you'll see how much actually comes off when you go to wipe. So just make sure you're not applying too much caulking to the actual surface, because you will wipe off quite a bit when you go through to rub your finger over it. And I just used a wet rag and wiped it all off with my finger. So. I just went along caulking all the seams anywhere the trim touched the wall or where the trim met the trim. So you can use a caulking tool, a caulking spatula, if you want it to be a super perfect line, but a finger really works well. And you don't want to leave a large bead of this stuff left over. You really want to wipe off a lot of it or most of it, and just leave virtually none, just enough to fill whatever gap is there. So moving on to the priming, I know that these boards are already pre-primed, but it's good practice to just go over them all again. And I'm going to be using this bin primer. It's shellac based, so it isn't as easy to clean as a water-based primer, but it works a whole lot better. It's probably one of the best primers in the market for stain blocking and for covering wood grain and stuff like that. So I'm going to be brushing over everything, and I'm just going to be using a brush. I don't really have a weenie roller to get the spaces, but I will be spraying the top coat. I just didn't want to run this through my sprayer because it's a little harder to clean than water-based paint. So. So the next day, after the primer dried, I went ahead and sanded it lightly with 220 grit sandpaper. I used this little homemade sanding block, and I just really lightly went over it, not really much pressure at all. Once I sanded all of it nice and smooth, I wiped it with a wet rag, and then I went ahead and taped off everywhere I didn't want to get paint. So to spray, I'm going to be using the HomeRite Finish Max Super. I'm using the black fan tip, or the black fan nozzle with the green tip. And based on the book that they give you, that's what they recommend for a fine finish using latex paint. I've only ever sprayed polyacrylic with this gun, so we'll see how this goes. I'm going to be thinning down this emerald urethane trim enamel 10%. So I'm going to do 20 ounces of paint and 2 ounces of water. For the paint, this is the color is Snowbound and it's Satin. And this was the highest quality paint. Not cheap, 90 bucks a gallon. So hopefully this works out good. So I went ahead and stirred this for a couple minutes actually. It took a little bit of time for all of the water to fully mix in with the paint. And I also use these paint filters. Whenever you're spraying paint, you want to make sure you run it through a filter because any sort of clump or chunk can get caught and screw up your spray pattern. So you really want to use a filter. I got these from Harbor Freight, so they're really cheap. It's really worth it just to use the paint filter. And then I went ahead and tested my spray pattern on the rosin paper that I had taped to the wall. Once I was happy with the way it looked, I went ahead and started painting the surface. Now this paint sprayer is really nice because it's all self-contained within this unit. All you need is an extension cord. You don't need a separate compressor or anything else. It's just a self-contained unit powered by regular electricity. And it's pretty affordable too. It's only $100 for this paint sprayer. And it ended up working out pretty good for me, so. So I let this dry overnight, and when I came and felt it this morning, it wasn't as smooth as I wanted it to be. It was a little rough, so I went ahead and sanded it all again with 220 grit sandpaper. Just finished wiping it all the dust off with a wet rag twice, and then I retaped everything because I ended up pulling it off the wall thinking it was done. So I'm just gonna add one more coat, and then that should be it, and that should be final for this. So I've never sprayed paint with this gun before, so I'm not going to go into too much depth as far as what I did and the settings I had it on because I'm not sure I was even doing it right, but it came out good in the end. So you just want to mess around with it until you're comfortable with how it's laying out the paint. So once I finished spraying it, the surface looked a little orange peely, and it actually had a lot of little air bubbles in it, so I was worried it wasn't going to lay as flat as I wanted it to, but once it dries and levels out, it ends up looking really nice and smooth. So don't worry if the texture looks a little off, just leave it and it will level out. And here is the final product. This is actually a few weeks later. I forgot to actually film the final clip until I was editing this video. So as you can see, no micro bubbles in the finish that you can see at all. The paint came out relatively smooth. It was a little rougher than I expected it would be. I probably could have used one more coat or maybe sanded the surface a little bit better, but it ended up being totally acceptable to me. So just keep in mind, it might not be as smooth as you think it will, and you might need to do extra coats if you're looking for a silky, silky smooth finish. But I was happy with the way it came out. The panels themselves had a little bit of rough spots, and where I filled the seam of the wall liner, it could have been a little smoother, so I may have wanted to sand that more, but I'm happy with the way that it came out, and it looks really good. It really improves the overall look of the room. So Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more videos in the future.